So, welcome to this technical deep dive. As you can see, we are very technical. My name is Steen, and this is my colleague Rune, and we are both developers on the Prefab project. Today we will go through the basics of prefabs, just to recap everything for all of you who haven't worked with prefabs in a long time. We'll introduce a new concept of prefab importers. Prefab Mode. We'll look at nesting and overrides at multiple levels. We'll look at unpacking prefabs and simple refactoring. And the takeaway we hope you'll get from this is knowledge of how the backend works and of the change in Unity's handling of prefab assets. Also understanding of the implications of nesting and overrides, and a few tricks for working with variant inheritance. Okay, so back to basics. Prefabs 101. You have a game object in a scene. It has a property X. Oops. There's supposed to be an animation here. There it is. You can turn this into a prefab by dragging it from the hierarchy into the project view. Prefabs can have overrides on the instance, like this, as you all know. What some of you probably don't know is that there is the concept of a corresponding object. That is that each instance in the scene, each object in that instance has a reference back to the asset object that it comes from, so that not only does the prefab know which asset it comes from, but each object knows exactly which object it is spawned from. And this is a concept we call a corresponding object. For those of you who have used the API before, it's the same as a get parent object, if anyone knows. It's and a full instance, like this table instance, it has a game object at the root called table, it has a leg, and it references into the asset, not only the game objects, but also all of the components. And this is how we apply a single property. We move it to the corresponding object, and then we merge it, the asset back into the instance, and the instance is updated. So the concept of nested prefabs shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. We have the table instance in the scene. We have the table prefab asset in the middle. And the prefab asset has a vase asset, a reference to the vase prefab. The concept of variants is very similar, actually. In the scene, you have the instance. It references a cat prefab variants, and that is basically an instance of, in this case, the animal prefab. The difference between nesting and variants is that the variants is basically spawning the instance at the root of the prefab. So what is a prefab instance? It's actually an object we have in memory, a prefab instance object. So in the scene, there's more to what you see in the hierarchy, actually. In the hierarchy, you just see the game objects, you see the table and the leg. But there is another object in the scene which you don't see, and that's the prefab instance handle. It's actually a little more than just a handle, because it also manages where in the transform hierarchy the instance is located. It has a list of all of the overrides and any optionally deleted components, and it has a reference back to the asset that it comes from. So, what does the prefab look like in a scene? In this very, very simple scene, we have a main camera, we have a direction light, and we have a prefab instance. And we don't have all of the objects that the instance is going to expand into when you load it. So you load the scene, And now the prefab expands. It basically looks at the prefab instance handle, and it says, oh, I'm from this asset, and then it spawns it into the scene during the loading. And it also loads the prefab instance handle object itself into memory as well. So we have that all in memory. So if any of you have opened a prefab file in a text editor, if you've set serialization mode to text, you will have noticed that the prefab file is actually pretty much the same thing. It has a list of game objects. So it's actually very similar to scenes. So why don't we do the same thing? Why don't we just put a prefab instance in there and we have nesting? In order to do that, we need to change how Unity handles prefabs. So this is where the new Prefab Importer comes into play. Do you guys know what the importers are? They handle all of the assets. When you drop it into the project browser, it imports it and converts it to something that Unity can understand. For prefabs, it's always been the case that the importer would simply register that it's there and nothing else. It needs to register it in order for it to show up in the project browser, but it doesn't do any processing. It doesn't do anything to the objects. We do that now. So we have the Prefab Importer grabs the source file as it looks. It's just two simple game objects. It processes it, and into the library folder, it will now put a processed version of your prefab source asset. It'll have the same objects, plus an additional asset handle at the top. All of the objects in the asset points to this prefab asset handle. So if you remember the corresponding object thing, if you have the instance and you find the corresponding object, there's a way to figure out the asset handle. And this is something we use internally to track what assets does each of the objects belong to. So we just expand the concept for nesting, and we say, why don't the prefab importer just treat the prefab as a scene, and when it encounters a prefab instance, just do the same thing as the scene does, load it, expand it, and bake it all out into the library folder. So what you're seeing here with all the arrows going around is that the table has the vars nested. So in the library folder, the vars object is in there now, and now it also has a prefab instance object in there that the vars is pointing at, but the vars is also pointing at the prefab asset handle. So there's a lot of pointers jumping around here. But that is the basic concept of nesting. We just treat it as a scene, and we process it during importing. We bake it out everything into the library folder. So I guess you can imagine what happens to variants. Variants is just a scene file with a single prefab instance. And when the importer detects that there are no game objects, but just a prefab instance, then it also registered it as a variant. All of this importing has to be done in the right order. When we bake the prefabs into the library folder, in order to be able to do that, we need to have the inner prefabs imported before we import the outer prefabs. So in this case, we have a chain of 3. So if you modify, or you have your outer prefab, and in that and in your middle prefab, you've nested your inner prefab. When you modify your inner prefab and write it to disk, we have to re-import the middle prefab in order to bake it into the library folder with the inner prefab inside it. And we also have to re-import the outer prefab to bake all of it into a third prefab in the library folder. So This is something you should be aware of when you use the new prefab workflows, because it does have an impact on your performance, or not your runtime performance, your editing performance. So when you edit your inner prefab and you save, and it might just be a single game object, why does it take 5 seconds to save? Well, it actually does that because it has to re-import 100 of your dependent prefabs. This is also why we don't recommend that you start out your scene as a single prefab and you nest everything inside it. It's just going to be too big, and it's going to take too long to re-import. It also has an implication on your build size. There's no change for scenes. It's always been the case that for a scene, we would bake out all the prefabs in the scene into the final build, and your scenes would grow in size. But for resources and asset bundles, this has an impact. I have here 3 prefabs. I have A, and I have B that nests A, and I have C that nests A. And when this lands in the library folder, A is going to be there 3 times, because it's all baked into the library folder. That also means that if you want to put B and C into resources or an asset bundle, you're going to get A in there 2 times. So something to be aware of. Luckily, it's only the game objects and components, so they shouldn't take up too much space, but do think about it. So I've been talking about all of these pointers. This is what it looks like, what the flow is. The prefab instance that has all its pointers back to the assets in the library folder, and the instance object in memory, and the asset that knows about its asset handle and internal nested prefab instances. So with that, I'm going to give it up to Rune.
Right. So now that we got the basics of prefab assets and instances, let's have a look at what that means for prefab mode. So as you probably know already, you can edit a prefab in prefab mode. And this is actually like looking into the container, which is a prefab. For example, if you have a prefab instance in your scene, then if you go in prefab mode, then you see the contents that are inside that prefab. Maybe you have an override in your scene where some value that's 1 in the prefab asset is overridden to 2. When you go in prefab mode, you see the 1 because you don't see the overridden value on the instance in the scene. Oops. This is also why when you're in prefab mode, you're editing the asset content, not a prefab instance. And this is why the objects don't look blue. They're not prefab instances. They're just regular game objects, just like game objects in a scene. This is because the contents of a prefab is basically the same as the contents of a scene. And when you're in prefab mode and save the changes either with autosave or manually, we call that saving the changes. Just like you would save the changes in a scene, we don't say that you apply the changes, because applying is something you do when you have a prefab instance and you apply from the instance to the asset. Here, there's no instance at all. You're just editing the asset directly in prefab mode, so you save the changes. Right, so just an overview of the whole relationship. You have the prefab instance at the top, where you can apply down to the prefab asset at the bottom. From either the instance or the asset, you can open the prefab into prefab mode, where you're seeing the contents of the prefab. You can save any changes you make, which go to the prefab asset. And any changes made to the prefab asset, whether they come from saving from the prefab mode or from applying from an instance, they will cause instances of that prefab to be automatically updated. So let's talk a bit about corresponding objects when you have nesting. So we saw before, all objects in an instance have corresponding objects in the assets. That's for all the game objects, all the components. And in this case, we have a nested prefab called vase, and it also has a corresponding object. But the picture here is not the full picture, because in this case, you essentially have an instance of an instance. You might have your original vase as a prefab asset, where a value of 1, then that might be nested inside the table prefab, where the value is overridden to 2. And then again, the table, let's go to the next slide. Then again, in the instance of the table, in the scene, the vase could again have some value overridden to a value of 3. So there can be overrides at multiple different levels. For a variant, the corresponding objects are similar. You might have an animal prefab, which just has a game object in it. Then a cat prefab, which inside it contains instance of the animal prefab. This is actually worth paying attention to here, because in the middle we have the cat prefab asset, and inside it you see a prefab instance, but that's an instance of the animal. Even though it's called cat, it's still an instance of the animal prefab. But again, you have the corresponding object chain, where the scene in the object has a corresponding object in the cat prefab asset, and that has a corresponding object inside the animal prefab asset. So let's dive deeper into overrides at multiple levels. Let's take the basics just with this visual metaphor in these GIFs. A prefab instance can have overrides. That's like something you stick onto the prefab instance container, but if you peek inside of it, you won't see the override. But a nested prefab instance inside an outer prefab can also have overrides. You will see those if you go into prefab mode, but if you see the outer prefab from the outside via a prefab instance of that, then you cannot see that it's overridden inside the prefab. This is illustrated here that you can see the number 2, the value of 2, but the fact that it's an override is only visible when you peek inside and look at the contents. It's not something, it's sort of hidden when you see it from outside the prefab instance. If we take it all together, or not all together yet, but here we can see the inner prefab instance inside the outer prefab can have an override, but then again the outer prefab instance, for example in your scene, can also have an override. And the outer override sort of takes precedence because it shadows the inner override. And you can have these overrides at every level except the innermost, because the innermost level is always just a plain game object, and you cannot have overrides just on a game object. You always have overrides on prefab instances. So the innermost one doesn't have an override, but then every time it's instance at multiple levels, you can override it at every level outside. So how do you actually work with overrides? Maybe some of you saw it in the previous talk, but for either properties or entire components or game objects, you can right-click on them, and if there's multiple levels of overrides possible, you will see a menu where you can choose where you want to apply your override to. So in this case, if we have an instance of our table in our scene, but we are looking at a property on the vase, which is a nested prefab, then that override could be applied either as an override inside the table, or it could be applied as a value to the vase itself. Let's go a bit in detail with what this actually implies. We start with the simplest case, which is applying to the outer prefab. In this case, we have our override in the scene of a value of 2, and it's applied to the instance of the inner prefab inside the outer prefab, where it now lives as an override there. the instance in the scene is no longer an override. Overrides always disappear when you apply them. So now it inherits the value from the outer prefab. The next example is we apply to the inner prefab instead. Again, we have a value of 2 as an override in the scene. We apply it to the inner prefab. Here, it doesn't stay an override. It becomes just a regular value because we cannot have overrides on regular game objects. And then the outer prefab inherits the value, and the instance in the scene inherits the value as well. Now let's get to the most complicated case, which is, again, applying to the inner prefab, but where the outer prefab has an override already. So in this case, the outer prefab asset has an override on its instance of the inner prefab of 2, but also the instance of the outer prefab in the scene has an override to the same property where the value is 3. And now we apply this override of 3 all the way to the inner assets. So before we actually go through what happens, let's make a little thought experiment and think about what could happen. So the 3 could be applied to the inner prefab, so it gets a value of 3. And the override is removed from the scene because overrides are always removed when we apply them. But the outer prefab has an override of 2. So now the instance in the scene, since it's no longer overridden, would inherit a value of 2, meaning that what you would see is that when you apply the value of 3 to the inner prefab, the value would immediately change to 2 afterwards. Our experience was that this seemed very surprising, unexpected, and frankly like a bug. So we decided not to make it work that way, but work a different way instead. And this is what I'll show now. We still start by applying the override to the inner asset, where it becomes just a regular value. But crucially, we remove the override from the inner prefab instance in the outer asset, just to that property which we are dealing with here. So it no longer has an override, and instead inherits the value of 3. Now the instance in the scene, this property also inherits the value of 3. So the entire chain from the instance that you were working with to the object that you are applying to will all lose their overrides. Sorry, that was one step too far. This is something to be aware of. For example, if you have source control and you look what files were changed after you applied to an inner prefab, you might see that some other prefabs were changed as well because they lost their overrides. So this is by design because we found this to be the least surprising and most expected behavior. If you want instead to just change the value on the inner prefab, you'll have to dig in and change the value there instead of working from it remotely from the instance in the scene. All right, I'll talk a bit now about unpacking. But before we do that, a little detour. A new consequence of the new system is that prefabs can no longer be disconnected. So disconnected prefab instances is something we used to have where certain operations like deleting a game object in a prefab instance or reparenting objects would disconnect the prefab instance from its asset, so it would no longer receive updates from the prefab. This turned out to not be compatible with nesting. There are some logical inconsistencies, ambiguities where this was not something that we could keep on supporting if we also wanted to have nesting and variants. So you can no longer disconnect prefabs. On the plus side, this means you don't have these situations where you have prefab instances, but they don't get updates because they're disconnected, and this can cause confusion. But it is something to be aware of. What we have instead, which can solve some of the same use cases, is that you can unpack prefabs. If you have a prefab instance, for example, in your scene, you can right-click on it and choose Unpack Prefab from the context menu. This is essentially the opposite of creating a prefab. You have your prefab instance, you take out the contents, and then replace the instance with the contents that were inside the prefab. Before we discard the instance completely, though, we take all the overrides that were on the instance and apply them to the content. This means that the objects and all the property values they have are exactly the same after unpacking as they were before. The only thing that changes is that what was a prefab instance before is no longer a prefab instance. Actually, it's a little bit inaccurate to say that unpacking makes the prefab instance into game objects. This is only sometimes the case. If we look at, well, it's more correct to say that we unpack the prefab contents one layer. So for example, if we have a prefab variant instance and you unpack that, then again you get the contents of the prefab variant, which happens to be the base prefab that it inherited from. Again, you get all the overrides. Maybe the prefab variant had overrides inside of it. That's actually likely because that's the whole point of variants. And you'll get those, but if there were overrides to the same values on your instance of the variants in the scene, then those overrides will take precedence, like the animation illustrates. Now, if you wanted to actually just have game objects after you unpacked, like you don't want the base, you don't want nested prefab instances to still be instances, you just want plain game objects for the entire sub-hierarchy, then you can also do that. Maybe you notice there's another menu item called Unpack Prefab Completely. It's like a recursive unpack. It unpacks the instance, and then any other instances that result are also unpacked. Now that we covered like creating and unpacking prefabs and have a better understanding of the contents, we can talk a little bit about some simple refactoring operations that you can do with, particularly with prefab variants. All these operations, they don't change the what objects you have or what the values are. They all preserve that, but they change some relationships about whether something is an instance of something else or not. So the first thing is, let's say you have a prefab called cat, but you want this to become a prefab variant of another prefab called animal. Now, you might already have instances of cat in your scenes, used lots of places, so you don't want to create a new variant of an existing prefab, because then you would have to replace all your instances with that variant. Instead, you have your existing prefab that already exists, and you want to change the status of that prefab so that it becomes a prefab variant. This is something you can do. You can go into prefab mode of the cat prefab, and in the root you will see a regular game object, and you can make that regular game object into a prefab and call it animal. Now, because it's no different from making any other regular game object into a prefab, but because the consequence here is that you actually are making the existing prefab into a variant, we want to make sure that you are aware of what you're doing. So you get this dialog. If you proceed and choose Create Base, then the root is become an instance of the new prefab you created, which is animal. And this means that cat, since it now has a prefab instance as its root, which is the whole definition of a variant, it means that cat is, the cat prefab is now a variant of animal. So now let's have a look at the reverse. You have your cat, it is a variant of animal, but you change your mind and you actually want it to be just a regular prefab instead that doesn't inherit from animal. You can do that as well. Again, you start by going to prefab mode of the cat, and then you unpack the instance at the root of cat, which is an instance of animal, this means you get the contents of that instance, which is the game objects that's inside animal, plus all the overrides that is contained in the cat prefab. So this means now again, at the root of the cat prefab, you just have a regular game object. No objects or properties change, but it's no longer inheriting from the animal prefab. Now the animal prefab still exists. It might still be referenced various places in your scenes or in other prefabs, but the cat prefab doesn't reference or use it in any way anymore. So maybe you are thinking, can you make a prefab become a variant of an existing other prefab? And unfortunately, the answer is no, that would not be simple. Because a variant is just an instance of another prefab plus some overrides. If you wanted to make an existing prefab a variant of a completely unrelated prefab, then you would sort of have to replace something rather than just change the status of objects. And you would have a question of, well, you have the game object that's already in the instance, but you also have the root from the variant. Which one should be the actual new game object? And we wouldn't be able to maintain all references. You would get some reference breaking. So this is unfortunately not possible. Maybe it's possible with some downsides and limitations, but not something that arises automatically from the existing system. Before we end, let's go just a little deeper with this simple refactoring operations and look at something where you have longer inheritance chains. So we start again with our cat prefab that inherits from the animal prefab, but maybe you want a new prefab in between cat and animal, which is called mammal. So you want cat to inherit from mammal, mammal to inherit from animal. And how can you insert another prefab into the inheritance chain? You can do that, again, by going into prefab mode of the cat prefab, and then the root of that hierarchy there, you make into a prefab. Now you might say, well, it's already a prefab instance. What do you mean to make it a prefab instance? But like I believe, I don't know if we covered it earlier, it depends on whether you saw Chiri's talk, but you can drag a prefab instance into the project view, and it makes it a variant of that other prefab. So you can do the exact same thing here and make cat become a variant of a new prefab. Because the consequences are, again, a bit complex to keep in your mind, we have a dialogue, this time a bit more complex, to just make sure that you actually get what you are expecting. And here you can choose to replace the base or to insert a new base. This is basically just, again, creating an original prefab or creating a variant, but where we make it clear that creating a variant is actually equivalent to inserting a base. If you go ahead and choose insert base, then we have the scenario we wanted. Cat now inherits from mammal. Mammal inherits from animal, and we inserted a new prefab into the inheritance chain. I have one last example, which is the reverse of what we just did. We have cat that inherits from mammal. Mammal inherits from animal, but we want cat to inherit directly from animal without using mammal anymore. Now, before I go ahead and talk about this, I want to hear, do anyone have any idea how you would accomplish this? Any takers? Yeah? Right. You're saying just unpack the cat prefab. And I assume you mean the instance inside the cat asset prefab. And that's exactly right. You unpack the instance inside the cat prefab, which is an instance of the mammal. This means that you get the contents of the mammal, which was an instance of the animal. So now the cat prefab has an instance of animal, and that's exactly what we wanted. Again, the mammal prefab still exists. You might still be referencing using it other places. And the mammal still inherits from animal too, but the cat doesn't inherit from mammal or use it in any way. So that's some of the simple refactoring things you can do. Just not something we actually implemented except for the specialized dialogues. It's just an emergent property of how the system is designed. And that's the end of the refactoring details and actually also the end of this talk. So thank you very much. And if you didn't see it already, you can get the preview here.
And we are, of course, open for questions now, if you have any.
Yeah. Hi, I was wondering about the asset bundle things.
Yes.
So let's say you have an FBX, like a model,
Yeah.
and you have a prefab of it, and
Yes.
you put it in an asset bundle.
Yeah.
And then you make another asset bundle with a prefab variant that has this, also a reference to this FBX.
Yeah.
That means that the FBX goes in the two asset bundles separate. So you have the weight, like the size of the FBX twice.
You have the size of the game objects twice, but the meshes and the materials and so on are not copied as long as you have the dependencies between your bundles set up correct. I assume you're talking about you have bundle dependencies, right?
Well, no dependency. I mean, you have two different prefabs that has the same model inside. And you put each one of these prefabs in different asset bundles.
Yes.
And then you load them. Is the same mesh going into memory, or are two different meshes going into memory with different GUIDs?
That depends on how you set up your asset bundles. Because with the asset bundle system that was introduced a few years ago, you can have dependencies between asset bundles.
Yeah.
And it can detect that, oh, you're actually reusing the same mesh. So I don't need to copy the mesh. If you don't have that, if you have two completely separate asset bundles, you would have this case. You would have like two completely different instances of the same FBX, and they would be loaded into memory and take up twice the memory.
All right.
Right.
Thanks.
Maybe to add to that, like that is not different from today. There's no change there caused by the changed prefab system.
Yeah.
Hello. I have a question. What type is the prefab inside the asset database? When I query asset database, give me something at this path. Does the new prefabs have different types, or are they just game objects like it is now? So can I like query for the base of the prefab? Can I know is it the variant or is it not when I just read the asset database?
Right. It's complex. It's still game objects. But with the Prefab Utility API, you can query for what kind of prefab it is, and you can figure out if it's a variant, and you can use the get corresponding object to actually go to the base prefab.
Okay, thank you. And with the editor, you were showing like the pretty blue line on the left edge of the inspector. And how would that work with the editor GUI begin property and end property? Because begin property and end property does not like take rect as the position. And for example, you can have two properties within the same component that you render in the same line within the begin and property section because reasons. And it used to handle like the prefab overrides and bold sections. So right now, if I have the right property changed as an override, does the begin and property handle the proper UI for this line?
I'm not familiar with the end property, but the line is always drawn all the way to the right. So we showed examples with, for example, position or rotation. There's also multiple properties on the same line there, but the blue line is always all the way in the margin.
Okay, thank you, I guess.
Thanks for your talk. I have a feedback and a question. First, with this complicated applying example, where you actually change the value from the middle one when you apply the outer one, I would like a warning message there too, because I think you could break something without noticing it if it's that way. And my question is, what happens when you delete a prefab that actually has children and variants and so on?
You mean if you have prefab A and you nest prefab B inside it, and then you delete prefab B at some point, the actual asset. So A will still be valid, and it will actually still contain B's children, all the game objects from B, until the next time you re-import A, because then it cannot find B, and it cannot bake it into the library folder. And what you get is, as you get today, when you open a scene, you see a game object saying missing prefab. And you'll get the same in your baked prefab as well.
And also if you have variants or something, they will also not work anymore when you delete the original.
No.
Okay. So if I delete something, all the variants and prefabs where it's nested in are broken.
Yeah, if you delete something that is inside another prefab.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hey.
Hi.
So the talk before, I was talking about the scene that you could use as like a preview behind the prefab mode. I was wondering, I didn't agree with the decision, whatever. But I was wondering, I could maybe implement this myself by simply having the editor callbacks from the prefab mode window itself. So I was wondering if there are like callbacks we can subscribe to with editor scripting to detect prefabs being opened and which prefab that then is, stuff like that.
Mads, are you still here? What's the answer?
And also it also exposes the editor's setting. Cool.
Okay, so for those who didn't hear Mads, the answer is yes to both.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Hi. I wonder what's the actual benefit of having the prefab variants, this like inheritance pattern? Can't we just get away with always the composition pattern of just having a single nested like child?
Yes. But then you have another game object at the root.
Yeah, so is it just for the sake of not having an additional layer?
Yes.
Or there any other benefit?
Yes, it's for the sake of not having something else at the root. It's the instance itself that's at the root.
Hi. So maybe I didn't listen good enough, but when you add an override to a nested prefab, do you save this like the animation, for example, does by path, or does it have ID? So my question is, if I would rename something in the hierarchy, would that work, or?
So, prefab property modifications, I don't know how many of you have worked with them, but in the scene, the prefab instance object that I was referring to, the instance handle, it has a list of these are the overrides.
Yeah.
And this is done, there's two things to this. There's a reference to the object. So you can rename the object or change it in the hierarchy, that's fine. But the property name is a string. So if you have a mono behavior where you named it my game object, and you set a reference to it, and you make it a prefab, and you make it an override, what will be stored in the override is my game object. Then you go into the script, and you say, I want to rename this to bad robot. And in that case, you lose your override, because we cannot handle the change of the strings.
Right.
There is an attribute called previously serialized as.
Formally, yeah.
Formally serialized as. It fixes it sometimes. But if you change the type, it can't fix it.
Sure. All right. Thanks.
Hi. One question. I noticed that there was a talk earlier about the addressable asset system. So can you actually reference both prefabs and variants from the new addressable asset system?
You can reference the assets, yes. So that is the prefab asset and the variant asset, yes.
Okay. and I have another one. Sorry. When you override inside the hierarchy of your prefabs, it's very easy, at least I can think of, that you have a lot of prefabs and you're not really aware of all the things that you're going to modify with that. Is there any way to list them so that you can visualize what you're going to, well, apply your changes to?
You mean when you have an instance and you want to apply?
So basically, if you have a prefab that has nested prefabs and those nested prefabs have variants, is there any way to visualize when you're going to make a change if, well, basically if you're going to break any other of your... I know it's a very difficult.
Yeah, it's a general problem anytime you reference assets. So if you change the material, it might break like some places that use that material.
Yeah, you might override something that's already overridden in one of your variants.
That's true. Like things get a little more complex with prefabs. We don't have anything built in to show you like all the places where something is used. It's a general feature that is in Unity, neither for prefabs or for other asset types. It's something that can implement, like it's possible to create custom tooling for it using the API we have available right now, but we don't have a solution that comes out of the box for these kind of things.
Okay. Oh.
Hi. Actually, I think this question was just answered, but my idea was now, since we have this beautiful shader graph, maybe it would help to have some prefab dependency graph.
Yes, it would. And we would love to give it to you, but time constraints right now means that we cut it from the first version and we are considering it for later. But basically, it can be built by using the corresponding object pointers. You can follow those around and build a graph.
All right, thank you.
Hi, thanks a lot for all your efforts and great work. What I can tell so far, the new prefab system looks really great. What I was thinking is, will you implement something like all the create menus for cubes and UI stuff, that those are actually prefabs? Because it would be great to just define your own button, and whenever you create a button, you don't have like the old text component on it and stuff like that.
You want like a creation selection, like create something based on this prefab.
Exactly, for all the built-in stuff, or you can override it.
I think something like that makes sense. Like basically exposing alternative way to easily instantiate certain prefabs where it's easily available, maybe in menus, maybe some other way. I think it makes sense, and even made sense before this. But it's a little bit out of the scope of what we do with the prefab system itself. I think it's something that should be considered, definitely.
Cool, thanks.
Hi. When I saw your slides, something just occurred to me. So I have to ask, why does the icon for GameObject use the colors of a right-handed coordinate system when Unity uses a left-handed coordinate system?
I believe somebody else actually noticed that and have some updated icons where it was fixed, or I can't remember. But nicely noticed.
Hi. What happens if I want to delete a component or a game object inside of an override or a variant?
So components we support. As you can today, you instantiate your prefab into a scene, and you can delete the components. But game objects we can't support. So if you create a variant of a FBX model and you want to delete parts of the hierarchy because you don't need it, it is unfortunately something we don't support. The workaround is to deactivate them.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, I wanted to ask about the resources saving. You said that if you had nested prefabs inside of prefab, all of the nested prefab will save the parent to the resources too. So if you have some kind of like dynamic UI system when you're loading prefabs, which are constructed from different prefabs, and they are reusing the prefab. So, for example, you have 5, I don't know, screens. Each one has 5 nested prefabs. So you will have for each nested prefabs 5 duplicates of the screen, and these duplicates will basically grow.
Yes.
All right. And is there some way around it, or
no? But but you're right. It is an issue, and that's why I want to create awareness about this. The lucky thing is that game objects and components take up very little space compared to your textures in your UI. And of course, the textures would not be duplicated 5 times because that's just a single reference. But your game objects will be there multiple times.
Okay, so be careful, right?
Yeah.
So just regarding this, why do the prefabs have to be baked at all? I mean, I know that right now they are like editor only, but what speaks against doing the prefabs and just initializing the nested prefabs at runtime? So you wouldn't have to bake them, and you wouldn't have this problem with like all the resources in there and doubling the game objects and stuff.
So you mean in the scene, instead of baking the prefabs into the scene, you could bake them into like, resources and instantiate them.
You have the handles, and you just, the moment you load the scene in the game later on, just instance the nested prefabs there.
I think there's a few reasons. One is we will be trading the storage for CPU time to compute all the, not just instantiating, but also prefab merges because of all the overrides you can have. And another reason is I think this was attempted before, and it made things very complex.
Yes, for the editor side, it was actually attempted in the editor. Instead of baking the nesting, we would, when you instantiate something, we would detect, oh, there's something referenced, we need to instantiate that. Oh, there's something else referenced, we need to instantiate that. And that became very, very complex, not only for our users, but also for us to maintain the code and figure out how it actually worked. When we came up with this approach, everything just clicked into place, and it made it a lot simpler to do. So that's why we pre-bake all our prefabs.
Okay, thanks. Maybe one last question. As all of the stuff that was really specific to scenes is kind of going out of the scenes, like nav meshes and maybe even light-baked data and stuff, is there some time, or why should the scenes not be prefabs?
It's a very good question.
Kind of the same.
and with this, we treat them the same now. The importer, it basically reuses the scene loading code. And it says, oh, here's a prefab. Well, we sent it to the scene loading code, and then it handles all the merging and all of the stuff that scene loading does. It checks for validity and all of that. So they are, from a code point of view, the same thing, but to the user, they're not.
And there are no intents to change that, I guess?
Maybe.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question. With an exception of this nested prefabs and the source control, should we expect some unexpected, like gifts from merging the prefabs? I mean, how much more complex became the prefab itself?
How much more complex the prefab itself became?
Yeah.
So. Like it's a bit comparing apples and oranges. If you compare something with lots of nested prefabs and variants with just plain game objects from before, of course it is more complex when you use all these new complex features that weren't there before. We hope that at least for like if we compare the same thing where you have just a plain prefab, that it feels safer and where you can use it with more determination. Like you decide, do you actually want to make a change to the prefab asset, or do you want to make a change just to a specific instance? And you can see all the overrides better than before and stuff like that. So we've done what we can to try to improve the basic workflow, And hopefully that will also help with all the extra complexity, because there is more complexity with nesting and variants. And like many powerful features, like Chiru said as well, with great responsibility and so on, there's definitely, it's something where we will probably see, and we don't even know all of it yet, but we will probably see a lot of like best practices, how to keep your things structured, how to work with these things in a way that avoids pitfalls as best as possible. But since it's still a new feature, we don't even know all these things yet.
Yeah. I can only encourage you to go grab it, try it out.
Definitely. I think even today after the file.
Good.
Hello. So let's assume we have the complicated example of we have a prefab and nested prefab and middle prefab and an inner prefab, and they all have overrides.
Yeah.
And then we go, as you said, if you save it, it will be overriding. The override in the middle will be gone, and then the other prefabs will get affected. But if we unfold the prefab, would that be the same thing?
If you unpack the prefab.
Unpack, yeah.
So the thing about unpacking is that it unpacks one layer.
Yeah.
So if you have an instance of the outer prefab and you unpack it, then it becomes the inner prefab. And then any changes you apply there is directly to the inner prefab, right?
Yes, but if on the instance of the outer prefab I have an override of a child of the inner prefab.
Yeah.
If I have that then.
So, yeah, can you go on? I think we didn't catch it the first time.
Okay, so I have a prefab and I have a middle prefab, and inside that I have a game object.
Yeah.
Okay, and then on the scene I have overrides on all.
Oh, you just override the properties on the game objects?
No, on the, yeah.
So you're not applying the properties into the prefab, but you have it on all of them.
I have inside an override, and also on the scene for the instance I have another override also. So normally, if there wasn't an override inside, when I remove it, the inner value would be like available when I unpack it. But if I have a value on the scene,
yes,
so there was a complicated example.
It's this one, right?
Yeah, this one. So in this situation, when I save it, so the 3 will go to the inner, and then the outer. Okay, it's the outer will have will lose its override.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So if I unpack this one on the left,
the scene instance.
The one on the scene, yeah.
Yes.
If I unpack that,
yes.
Then what would happen?
Like after or before you apply?
It would become an instance of inner.
No. So
Yeah.
okay.
It will become an instance of inner, but with the override value of 3 applied, so that the value doesn't change.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
It's complex.
Yeah. All right. Looks like that was it for questions.
Yes. So I want to mention that we are at the Meet the Devs booth tomorrow in the expo hall from 2 to 4. And you can come meet the both of us and Mads as well, who's sitting down here, who did most of the prefab mode. Come and have a chat. Go home and try it tonight, and then come discuss the workflows with us. Thank you very much. Okay.